Okay, good morning to everyone. It's great to have you here this morning. We have the second day of our TIPS forum, which is set to be a power-packed morning, and that should take us to lunch. And I'm here as moderator for this morning's session. So by way of introduction, my name is Muhammed Patel. I'm an economist at TIPS, and I work in the Sustainable Growth Unit. So this morning, we've got a lineup of presentations, and the session is adequately named Blind Spots of the Just Transition. And it really highlights some of the key areas that we need to be aware of as we embark on this ambitious process to transition towards lower carbon technologies and sustainable economies. So we're going to have a series of presentations. They explore a number of interrelated issues. We start off by looking at the domestic political economy and the impact of global geopolitics on South Africa's energy transition. We then move to issues around the co-prioritization of job creation and emission reduction. And finally, we end off with some insights around incorporating the just transition in sustainability reporting. So the way we're going to structure the session is that we're going to have inputs from our various speakers. I'm going to be quite ruthless with time, but if there are any additional issues, they can spill over into the Q&A that comes afterwards. So we'll follow with the Q&A where we really want the audience, both here physically and online, to interact with the content, and please feel free to engage and ask questions. So I'm going to introduce the speakers before each presentation, and then the speakers will take it from there. So starting off with our first presentation, we have Professor Mike Muller. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right. Mike Muller is a visiting adjunct professor at the Wits School of Governance and a registered professional engineer. He was NPC, National Planning Commissioner, and Director General of the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry. He also worked for the Mozambican government in the late 70s, 80s, before returning to South Africa and joining the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mike is also joined by Seán, and unfortunately, bio never made it to me for Seán. So Seán will do a brief introduction of himself. Gentlemen, please take it away.
Thanks, Muhammad. I just want to get our presentation. Okay, great. Yes, so my name is Seán Muller. So I'm not on the program, just a small miscommunication. I'm currently based at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. I was previously at the economics departments of UJ and UCT, and also worked at the Parliamentary Budget Office. My background is in economics, and you'll see my professional interests reflected in the slides that I'm going to deal with for our presentation today. The title speaks for itself. We're concerned that the just transition is actually going to be an unjust one, and partly because of domestic political economies and global geopolitics. So just not so much for provocation, but just to ensure that we're consistent and that we raise these issues in all relevant forums. We think it's great that TIPS declares its funding sources in a very transparent fashion, which is actually different from a lot of the other participants in these debates, and that's one of our concerns. But we do just want to draw attention to the fact that we should be at least asking the questions. You know, can we have debates on these issues that are funded by foreign governments and foreign donors that are really fully independent and that actually prioritize South Africa's national interests? For example, if you look at the UK government, the UK Confederation of British Industries thinks that the green agenda will drive economic growth in the UK and is the biggest economic and business opportunity for the UK. Furthermore, if you're aware of the politics in the UK at the moment, I think it's pretty clear that the UK government is not going to be funding anything that they don't think is in their national interest. And these are just the kinds of things we should just have on the table in all policy discussions, not just this one, but this is one of the most important ones happening in South Africa right now. So this is the structure of our presentation. We don't have a lot of time. I think we negotiated 20 minutes, but since we're starting late, we'll go for somewhere between 15 and 20. I'm going to start us off. Mike will deal with sections 2 to 5. And then I'll come back at the end to talk about financial and fiscal considerations and give you a conclusion. So just to start off with, and again, this is also partly reflecting my background in economics and thinking about social welfare issues. Our concern is also with, there have been some discussions in this conference so far about what a just transition is, and there's a little bit of disagreement about the definition of a just transition, but also what the optimal path is. Some people have the view that we actually know what we need to do to achieve a just transition, just a matter of political will. Other people say, well, actually the notion of just transition is contested. We have two concerns based on our assessment of what the dominant approach is to this notion in South Africa. The first one is that some approaches are too limited to the coal sector, miners, their families and communities. Those are, of course, very important stakeholders, and it's very important that their welfare be considered, but it's inadequate and misguided to just focus it in on that group. And it creates the possibility of an unjust just transition, which we take it is obviously absurd. Okay, so any definition you have of the just transition shouldn't allow for a transition that could be unjust. And if you have an overly narrow one, then the broad social welfare perspective, that could happen. A different kind of concern with some other approaches is that they're actually almost too ambitious. They essentially want to use the just transition as an opportunity to achieve structural change, which people have been pushing for elsewhere, and they haven't been able to achieve. And the problem with these two approaches, at ends of the spectrum, is that they can lose track of some key aspects of the actual transition itself. And one of them, for example, which I'll talk about later, is the fiscal aspect. So the right approach is to take a broad social welfare analysis where you essentially consider all relevant factors. So you consider fiscal incidence, as well as what's going to happen to employment in coal mining communities, as well as who's bearing the burden of pollution and so forth. So all of these things are important, and we argue for a broader notion of a just transition than just the focus, for example, on the coal sector, but perhaps a slightly more focused one than this broad notion that we're just going to use the just transition to achieve massive structural change, not just nationally, but also globally. Yeah, hand over to Mike, and then I'll come back.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and sorry for the two-handed approach, but I think it's necessary because there's an integration of disciplines that's required and an integration of approach. And it's important to have a theoretical approach. I come to this much more from a practical perspective, having operated in a lot of the systems that we're talking about. And I think one of the things I didn't declare in my bio and some of the other docs is that I just, before COVID, spent about 3 years helping Coarabassa, Mozambique's hydropower generator, think through its future. How could they contribute? What future could they have, given the opportunity that Mozambique has to expand its energy production? How do we now use that position in a changing Mozambique, Southern Africa, and changing world? So I've had to do a lot of thinking about climate, energy, development, region, and the dynamics around that. But talking about South Africa, and I think one of the more useful kind of approaches is not to look at comparative advantage in South Africa, but to really acknowledge the comparative disadvantages that South Africa has as we enter into this phase of global transition. And it's a global energy transition. The whole energy system of the world is being changed. This is kind of big stuff. And let's also recall that when the negotiation started, one of the great sort of challenges for the developing countries, for the global South, was to say, hey, we can't all follow the same approach. Firstly, you guys caused all the problems. And secondly, by the way, we have slightly different sets of circumstances and capabilities than you do. And this context of common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities, it's enshrined in Kyoto, really we need to think about what that means. And because of that, we need to locate South Africa very carefully in this global picture. And, it's tried to say South Africa is an energy intensive country, coal dependent, economic legacy constructed on racial oppression. And I don't think we emphasize how unique South Africa is. Hell, I don't want to start South Africa as a unique case, but South Africa is the most coal dependent country for energy systems of all countries over 10 million people. I actually went and checked the World Bank data. we are seriously coal dependent, which means a transition for us is really a dramatic problem. You know, as compared to some of our neighbors, and I know Mozambique well. Mozambique is a plethora of non-carbon opportunities. Their only problem is how to negotiate between the people who want to develop gas and the people who want to develop hydro. What a lovely problem to have. But you know, we're not in that position. So it is important that we also recognize that because we are so coal dependent, we're terribly vulnerable to these global forces, to the global penalties for not taking adequate measures to reduce climate action. And you know, the discussion about CBAM, and I can never remember what the abbreviation stands for, but the border measures to essentially punish countries that don't reduce emissions fast enough. We're desperately vulnerable to that. And we really need to have the argument and discussion about, has South Africa actually already used its so-called carbon space? You know, it's frustrating to see the political level saying we must be more ambitious in our carbon reduction, whereas I think our political stance should be to say, hell, given the fact that this was essentially a colonial economy, you know, it was developed, its mining industry was developed for the benefit of the metropole. Can we please have a bit of slack? Because look where it's left us. And the debate about what would be a just carbon share for South Africa, haven't got time to talk about it here, but is a really hot debate. We ought to raise it more forcefully, because we need to negotiate space for South Africa if we're going to survive this transition. So, you know, if the nature of our economy is the one huge disadvantage, so is the nature of our society, because the fragmentation of our society, you know, the extreme inequalities and diversities really makes it difficult to achieve a coherent consensus approach. And again, another aside, if we were to look at the concept of the environmental Kuznets curve, which I've done in the water sector, where you find that environmental priorities change as per capita income changes, you would agree that perhaps we have a problem here, that we have groups in South Africa who have fundamentally different interests and priorities, and this makes it difficult to even develop a strategy. It goes without saying that we have a national power utility which has got interlocking operational and financial crises to deal with, and that these failures, and these are political failures and as well as technical failures, provoke the financial burden that now constrains our new investment and traps us in the current circumstance. Goes without saying, in a country like ours with so much inequality and so much to be resolved because of that inequality, that our domestic financial resources are limited, and you know, the challenge of that structural poverty and economic exclusion makes it difficult to finance new investment, and sometimes we tend to miss that. So what does this mean in terms of the political economy? And how do these local interests and the sort of global geopolitics distort the transition? Certainly domestically, it's clear. Large corporations, wealthy individuals want you know, a transition strategy that maximizes benefits and profit share. They want to be able to defect from their public responsibilities, from the grid and its liabilities, but still hold on to some of the benefits. Wealthy countries want to maximize their fossil fuel rents, and I'll come back to this because it really is a dramatic impact on some of the other countries. So look at USA, Canada, and Australia, and I will. Other countries are really seeking economic advantage. Denmark, France, and UK, you can track exactly what their incentives are. And unfortunately, elements of civil society, and it's hard to be autonomous in a country like ours, have been recruited to promote larger interests, and quite often we find that the co-option capitulation is actually justified because there's a climate emergency. But we need to get back to that point. Just transition is about equitable sharing of costs and benefits locally and globally. Let's look at the wealthier countries and regions. They are aiming and working very hard and being very successful to maximize the benefits of transition. Australia in 1981, they were warned, our coal is going to come under climate attack. What did they do? They ramped up their coal mining industry, and they are one of the biggest exporters of coal. And they started drilling offshore gas, and they're now one of the biggest exporters of LNG. Canada doesn't need alternative energy sources because they've got hydro and nuclear, plenty of it, but they're mobilizing their dirty oil sands. USA, from being an energy importer, is now the largest global LNG exporter. They went from 0 to biggest in 6 years. You want to understand the Ukraine war? Look at that energy ramp up. Western Europe, you see what happens if you don't look after your energy dependency. We can talk about Ukraine. Look at what happens if you give way to domestic political enthusiasms. Look at what happened to Germany closing its nuclear. And the lesson from there is don't lose sight of energy sovereignty. There's significant uncertainty about the strategies that we have available to us, which systemic interventions are feasible. And we really have a problem in developing a sensible strategy for South Africa's transition because of the political pressures linked to the technical and economic uncertainties. What's going to be the role for hydrogen? We actually don't know. Sasol wants a huge amount of energy and for their potential hydrogen economy. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Optimal decisions in this process might be country specific, but if we don't take a whole system perspective, and you heard yesterday about the problems of trying to regulate individual energy sectors, you're going to make the wrong decisions. And we are missing in the course of the current discussion, the real big elephant in the room, which is we need to have resilience to low probability, high impact risks. And what's happening at the moment is we're delaying decision-making through arguments about gas and environmental impact, and we're not taking the right decisions at the right time to get us on the right pathway. The levelized cost of energy debate is an interesting one. This is what's used to justify the renewables, the intermittent renewable solar and wind. If you read the people's own literature, this is actually an unhelpful methodology because it misses out transmission and backup and storage, and it's no replacement for system-wide modeling. So just to give you a sense, we talk an awful lot about we need more renewable generation, but you know the promoters of this acknowledge that the generation is going to represent 40% of the investment. That'll be what the private sector is willing to do. Who's going to pay for the battery storage? Who's going to pay for the transmission expansion? Those are the other 60%. And guess what? It's expected that the public sector is going to do that. That's the end of my rant. Back over to Sean.
That needs to be the end of the presentation.
Right. I think according to my watch, I think I've got 2 minutes. So thanks very much for that, Mike. So just to finish with the financial concerns, I mean, essentially our view is, to put it bluntly, that the public has been misled by experts and journalists claiming that the renewable energy transition will benefit households financially and fiscally, Eskom and the fiscus. The opposite is most likely. We've got a big problem that's been alluded to over the last couple of days. Oh yes, we should look at the fiscal implications of decentralization. What is the government doing taking decentralization decisions when the fiscal aspects haven't been considered and decided upon yet? It's just irresponsible. Concessional loans quite clearly are being used to manipulate policy, or at least there's an attempt to do that, which is the tail wagging the dog. Looks a lot like the Russian nuclear deal, which I also criticized at the time, but different civil society partners. I've mentioned decentralized generation, which is essentially going to promote inequality as on the current trajectory. And linked to that, we see ignorant and fairly self-serving objections to grid connection fees. Okay, so to conclude, as Mike has noted, the scale of South Africa's transition is greater than most other countries because proportionally we're more dependent on coal than many others. And we also have a deeply divided society, which is where we're lacking resources. And we have a national power utility, for example, and public finances in a very poor state. It's crucial to synchronize operational investment and financing plans. I would particularly emphasize the financing side. for South Africa to achieve a genuinely just transition under the appropriate definition and to net zero in 2050, we need actions guided by competent, objective analysis, decision-making, and implementation. The vested interests, we need to put them on the table. They need to be challenged and they need to be managed where appropriate. Obviously, the technical and financial challenges and uncertainties need to be addressed. It's not obvious to us that the technical issues have all been resolved. But basically, as things currently stand, the current path, it's looking like we're going to have a very deeply inequitable, brutal transition for the majority of people in South Africa, and there's going to be a small elite who are going to benefit, and presumably that is not the purpose of a just transition. Thank you.
No, thanks very much for that thought-provoking and at times provocative presentation. So thanks for that. Next, we have an online presentation by Professor Anthony Black. Anthony Black is Emeritus Professor at the School of Economics, University of Cape Town. His main fields of expertise are development economics, trade and industrial policy, and he's acted as an advisor to the dtic on automotive policy and as a consultant to other African governments, as well as to a number of international organizations, some of which are the African Union, the OECD, and some of the United Nations organizations.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I'm teaching 3 courses here at UCT this week, including a little bit later this morning, so I just wasn't able to make it. And thanks also to the Mullers for certainly a provocative and thought-provoking presentation. I think this, in a sense, follows on quite well, and I'm sure will raise interesting issues for discussion. Right, so this is work that I've done with Harold Winkler, supported by the SARChI Chair on Industrial Development. And what I'm going to do is to really divide it into 2 parts. One looks at how we got to the situation of being a kind of high unemployment, high emissions economy, and then look at some policy options. Right, why won't my slides move? Okay. Right, so I think we know that our development path has led to low employment and high emissions. We had the historical development of the so-called minerals energy complex, which locked South Africa into a distorted growth path during the apartheid era. So that was based on low cost, highly subsidized coal-based energy, and led to a pattern of sort of very heavy industry development, which is both highly capital and energy intensive. Now, I think it's important to remember that this wasn't a kind of natural outcome that we had, or that we had the cheapest energy in the world at one point. Our energy system was subsidized in all sorts of ways, which I can't go into in too much detail. The regulation of the coal price, the way Eskom was financed, et cetera, and this was deliberate government strategy, was to create a system of very low energy costs, and that led, of course, with other forms of support, to a massive development of the heavy industry sector in the economy. Support included export incentives, if you remember, gas tax allowances, subsidies of various sorts. And this even continued after the democratic transition, when we had the introduction of the developmental electricity pricing program. Remember, back in those days, we had surplus power, so there was the scheme hatched to attract energy intensive users like aluminium smelters, for example, and also to build purpose-built infrastructure to attract those kinds of investments. So what you had was the this industrial structure based on heavy industry, which, as I said, was not in line with our actual comparative advantage. So it was a massive distortion in the economy, in my view. What Justin Lin would call a comparative advantage defying form of development. And that has actually imposed huge costs, both then and, of course, massive adjustment costs now. So if we look at our price, the price structure for electricity, and the diagram on the left only goes back to 2007. If you went back further, the divergence between OECD prices, this is for prices to industry, and prices in South Africa to industry, was even bigger. So that huge gap obviously underpinned the sort of the huge development of heavy industry in the country, and also related to that, the fact that it was based on coal, of course, high level of carbon intensity. On the right, you've got a similar picture, but it's important to note that that there's always been a bigger divergence between prices to industry and prices to consumers. In other words, a bigger divergence from, let's say, global prices. Heavy industry users have always benefited from particularly low prices in South Africa for power, until recently, of course. So the problem is that this whole model, the mineral energy complex, has begun to unwind because it's no longer viable. Obviously, there's been a high level of incompetence and corruption at Eskom, which has exacerbated the issue. But in any event, the whole model based on cheap power was really a subsidized model and going to be unviable in the long term. So we have electricity prices rising, constraints on infrastructure, poor regulation, all leading to a huge strain on this heavy industry segment of the economy and its associated sort of components. So the adjustment costs are very high because you've got the slowdown in heavy industry. You've had plant closures like Saldanha Steel. You've had a relative contraction in mining, or very poor performance relative to our sort of mining peer economies around the world, and coupled with that sharp fall in manufacturing employment, which has kind of collapsed. If you from 1.79 million in 81 to just 1.2 million in 2019, and a particular sort of losing sector has been the ultra labor intensive industries, footwear, clothing, and so on. So then, of course, the other point is that our GHG emissions intensity is extremely high. It's even higher now than China and India, where there has been significant reductions, but South Africa emissions per unit of output is now higher than in those countries. So we are a very emission intensive economy. And that is obviously a big issue, as the previous speakers pointed out, when it comes to potential problems we may face with cross-border taxes and so on. Right, so the economy has been based on subsidized coal-based energy. Again, things we know, very large long-term investments in coal and coal to liquid fuel. There's a lot of talk about the need for beneficiation in this economy, but if one defines beneficiation as the processing of raw materials, we've actually done a lot of that, including converting coal into liquid fuel. A large number of works in the coal value chain, but it's important to note that these numbers have been declining since the early 80s. Energy policy since 98 has been aimed at diversing away from coal and to manage environmental and health impacts. And then we've had the introduction of REI4P, but as we all know, the electricity supply system remains in crisis and faces and changes do face large political economy constraints. I think the points raised in the previous presentation are well taken, and perhaps there can be some discussion on this. But I do want to raise one point which has received very little debate, and that is, if you look at demand management and the need for demand management that we obviously require at the moment, there's been very little debate in the media or in nationally about really limiting demand by the large corporations which make up the energy intensive users group, which account for 40% of electricity demand. And I'd like to know, I mean, I wasn't able to attend much of yesterday, but it'd be interesting to know if there's been discussion on this issue, because it really makes sense in a situation of such supply constraints to restrict the consumption of these very heavy power users. And I know there are some methods in place, but I don't think there's been enough discussion or action on this point. Perhaps we can discuss it during question time. So the policy instruments for employment intensive low emissions growth, I'll go through this quite quickly. I think my time's coming up. Shifting incentives, attaching more emphasis when it comes to industrial policy on employment objectives, and obviously achieving synergies across industrial, energy, and climate policies. So the actual shifts that could happen, and I'm quite aware of the adjustment difficulties of this, reducing incentives to capital intensive high emissions heavy industry. Effectively, that is happening simply as a result of Eskom's problems, but it has to happen anyway. Ending direct and indirect support for cheap electricity, removing fossil fuel subsidies, which are actually quite significant in spite of the the volume of complaints about fuel prices and so on. And on the other hand, how can employment be efficiently subsidized? That again, on its own, is quite a big topic, so I won't go too much into it here. And we do argue in our paper as well for the extension to moving towards a universal basic income grant. So essentially, one's talking about shifting incentives to employment intensive and low emissions activities. With industrial policy,
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. We would be looking at employment in renewable energy and regional economic development, building competitive advantage in employment-intensive light manufacturing. I've argued a lot elsewhere on industrial policy in this respect. There are opportunities for energy service companies, including small and medium enterprises. There are also a lot of opportunities for agriculture, which particularly around employment and also in various ways to reduce emissions. So Nicola Wills, in her paper yesterday, she recently completed a master's thesis on this, and she's done quite a lot of work, interesting work on understanding which sectors are low in carbon intensity and high in employment intensity. Energy development paths, well, I think the directions there are kind of well understood as well. And I think interesting point on this was raised in the previous presentation. The unit costs of wind and solar have declined dramatically and are now highly competitive. I agree that there are issues to take into account in terms of battery storage and distribution. In the past, we missed out on climate finance. We need to take advantage of this offer, but of course it has to be managed in South Africa's own interests. Absolutely, that's absolutely essential. So we need to create synergies across industrial, energy, and climate policy. I won't go into this, but there's a lot of work on the just transition, and there are links to these policy documents are in the paper. So I won't go into those now, but let me just then conclude by saying that we've had this historically capital-intensive growth path, which has produced high emissions and also high unemployment. We need to align employment and mitigation objectives and manage the trade-offs. We need to, I suppose, quite carefully shift incentives to employment-intensive and low emissions activities. And there is a very difficult adjustment process, which actually is underway at the moment, partly due to policy, but actually partly not due to policy, just due to events, not least the problems of Eskom. And then industrial policy also, I think there needs to be a shift in emphasis. Historical support for heavy industry, capital investment, to giving much more emphasis to employment-intensive sectors and employment-intensive industries. And then, of course, one needs to align industrial, energy, and climate policy. Okay, so thanks very much. I'll end off there.
Great. Thank you so much for that very insightful presentation and really unpacking some of the important dynamics that one needs to take into account when thinking about South Africa's own journey towards a low carbon and sustainable economy. Next, we have our final input for the morning before we go to the Q&A session. And we have a presentation by, and I hope I pronounce this right because the apostrophe is throwing me off, Clémence McNulty, I hope that's right. Clémence joined EY in February 2022. She has 13 years of experience in sustainability strategy development across a wide range of sectors and has worked at the intersection of corporate strategy, finance, and the technical aspects of sustainability, which span environment, social, and governance, or ESG issues. Clémence is going to present for us this morning on incorporating the just transition into sustainability reporting. Clémence, you can take it away.
Thanks, and that was a great pronunciation. All right, how do I? All right, so we've got a couple of slides. I guess as context, you know, one of the things that's been in the news a lot recently has been the developments around sustainability reporting, how the private sector is disclosing better, or at least in a more consistent way, their initiatives. And one of the items that's of interest is how just transition is being integrated into these developments or not. So we really just did a comparative analysis of the trends and the different frameworks that exist out there. So I think the first point to make, and I think it's something that a few people have noted, is that obviously the transition is happening already. So, you know, we better obviously make sure that we understand where we are, how we're tracking, and the progress towards what may be a just transition. I think interestingly, what's happened is obviously the private sector and investors have realized, or at least are starting to realize, that just transition outcomes will ultimately be more beneficial for the private sector. So there's a quote here from BlackRock. Obviously, we know that BlackRock is a significant investor, drives a lot of activities. And they published a paper recently noting that companies that consider the impact of the energy transition on their key stakeholders, whether they be employees, customers, or the communities in which they operate, are likely to be best positioned over the long term. So this is really starting to show the attention that investors are placing on this. And obviously we know, and we've discussed a lot around the opportunities that it can present versus the risks. And I think this is an interesting study. This infographic, you can go to the study from the WEF, the World Economic Forum, but this actually shows a net positive job creation. So all of the green bars at the top are showing the green positive job creation potential, which is not just in renewables, which I think is an important point to note. And obviously we've got the red bars showing the decrease in jobs. But still coming out as a positive on average globally, obviously noting that we know workers, communities, and other stakeholders that are currently dependent on emissions-intensive industries are likely to face transitional and location-specific challenges, which is particularly important in the context of South Africa, as we've discussed. So with this acknowledgement that the just transition is important, and considering, and I'm not going to bore you with all of this and these acronyms, but the very, very rapid speed of development in terms of sustainability reporting practices and requirements in the last couple of years. It was a very long, slow start. You can see the GRI, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, is one of the key standards that is really framed the way the private sector reports on these issues that came in 1997. Then we had this very slow rise of standards. And then the last 2 years, don't ask any sustainability professional working in the private sector to tell you about the developments, because they are insane. And we're seeing a lot of regulation in the space, which hopefully will mean that we'll have more consistency, more convergence in the standards. And obviously this creates an opportunity to start thinking about how just transition concepts may be brought in to these frameworks. But at the same time, and I think a lot of speakers have noted, agreeing on a definition remains quite a challenge. I've just put it through, I think one of the big areas that's sort of been guiding is obviously the expectations around the Paris Agreement to really ensure a just transition. And that brings in a lot of concepts around transition of the workforce, creation of decent work quality jobs, and certainly the obligations on human rights and ensuring that these are met. I find the graphic here from the Just Transition Initiative framework quite useful in terms of categorizing the different types of approaches and different types of definitions. And it's really a 2x2. One is looking at the social inclusion aspects, and the other one is looking at distributional impacts. And certainly one of the things that we found in terms of the analysis around how the private sector is looking at it is they're much more focused on the inclusion aspects, more the engagement. How do they approach the engagement with their communities, the workers that are affected, and obviously a lot less consideration in terms of the distributional impacts, probably because that's tied to more government public sector action that needs to happen in parallel. But I think that distinction is quite useful in terms of thinking about the approaches that have really been driven. So within the paper, we looked at a couple of benchmarks or frameworks that have been developed for private sector thinking about the just transition. The Climate Action 100+ is a coalition of global investors looking to decarbonize energy intensive industries and obviously pushing for net zero. And they've defined a benchmark in terms of what the just transition might mean. We've got the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is an alliance that's been looking at what the private sector's role might be in terms of these transitions, global transitions, noting that it's not just an energy transition that we need to probably succeed in, but many other transitions in terms of a low carbon economy. And if we want to have, equitable access to health and other things, many other transitions we need to consider. We also have the Council for Inclusive Capitalism that came out with a just energy transition framework. And interestingly, the JSC recently published their sustainability and climate change guidelines. These are guidance, they're voluntary, but they are certainly, we hope, going to lead to more private sector reporting on some of these issues. And within the guidance, especially in terms of the climate change guidance, there's a recognition that companies should consider whether just transition is relevant to their operations. And certainly there's a couple of metrics that have been identified in terms of what companies should report on. So here, I think the reality is that it's first of all important to realize that the private sector's role and what the private sector will interpret as a just transition is likely to be variable, but there should be strong scrutiny to ensure that it's appropriate and will match with the broader societal needs. So these frameworks, and I've just summarized it, and there's a much more comprehensive comparison within the paper, have all identified specific metrics or indicators, which obviously link to specific actions that we'd like to see private sector actors taking in terms of the just transition. So this is just a summary of them. And I think what's interesting is going back to our 2x2, you can certainly see the intentions around engagement. So a lot of these actions and then the related metrics and indicators speak to ensuring that there's strong engagement with stakeholders, whether those are affected workers or communities around the just transition, and making sure that those voices get heard. And then the other big aspect that we see is around the actual plan. What's the plan? How are we going to manage our decarbonization journeys? So most of these are common through. I think what's interesting is in the Just Energy Transitions framework, the one in the third column, is that there is a little bit more of a recognition within that framework that we also need to consider access to universal net zero energy. So that notion of bringing in energy access into the concept of a just transition gets integrated there, which is a bit of an outlier, but I think very relevant, obviously, in the South African context. And then obviously in the last column, you can see, and the sustainability guidance from the JSE is, as I mentioned, voluntary and identifies both core and leadership metrics. So there's going to be a lot of interpretation at the company level around what's relevant, but is more focused on the reporting on the availability of a plan around committing to engagement with affected workers and communities, and tracking the impact on workers from that plan. And so it's interesting, obviously, noting as well, the PCC's climate transition framework, which identifies 4 priority sectors, obviously the coal mining, but also agri, tourism, and automotive, to consider whether other private sector companies that may be looking to report on these just transition aspects and looking at the JSE guidance will actually feel that they are impacted or not. So certainly, it could be interesting for the large property players. They might just say, well, we are not identified as a priority sector within the PCC's framework. And so maybe the just transition isn't important to us, which could be misguided and lead to missed opportunities. So the variability is obviously going to be a challenge, and one that needs to be understood. So we did identify across the 3 frameworks some common themes. So reporting on commitments around decarbonization and the related just transition impacts for stakeholders, engaging proactively on the just transition with impacted stakeholders, and obviously development of plans to address identified impacts. And obviously all of these are beneficial, but we did want to highlight that through the study, we also found that the initial assessments against some of the benchmarks that were identified paint a very gloomy picture of where we actually are. So you've got 2 graphics here. We've got the initial analysis by that Climate 100, looking at, I think, around 120 companies and where they're performing. And you can see the vast majority of companies not meeting any of the metrics. So that large 73% gray bar is showing a very significant lack of action. And where there is action, you can see that it's only in a few of the areas that have been identified as important to ensure just transition. So certainly lots of focus needs to go there. The other graph similarly is the first assessment that was done by the World Benchmarking Alliance. I think it's around 180 companies that were assessed. And obviously the road to just transition on the right-hand side of the graph with the bars, that is where we would like to see a lot of the companies being and showing progress. But what we have is unfortunately a vast majority of the companies scoring only 4 points or less. So 84 companies, 84% of companies scoring 4 points or less out of a possible 16 types of actions or indicators that have been identified to illustrate whether companies are performing on the just transition. Yeah, this is my last slide actually, so I should make it. But I think that analysis was interesting and obviously was very much focused on the private sector. And we know that the private sector operates in a context where they have investors, but also broader stakeholders, communities of workers, but also government. So we do recognize that we can't just think of the private sector as a vacuum, and we're also hopeful that there will public sector sustainability reporting that will be included. There is a paper that's currently out in terms of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, looking at what sustainability reporting might mean in the public sector. At the moment, the just transition concepts weren't highlighted, but we're hopeful that they will through some of the broader expectations around decent work creation and employment. And obviously that will help in terms of the comparison around private sector versus public sector reporting. I think the other aspect that becomes very important, and we're seeing this in terms of the broader evolution around sustainability reporting, is to really drive this consistency in terms of the indicators or the metrics that are going to be considered, and making sure that they're appropriate for the local context. And I think the JSC's guidance is very helpful in terms of an initial step, but I think really applying a true just transition lens to those metrics and to those reports with a bit more guidance might be very valuable, because certain of the concepts like universal energy access for all may be particularly important to achieve. And then obviously we know that the stakeholder voice, can often get lost in these processes. And whilst it's great to have the private sector reporting on the types of engagements that they're doing, the commitment that they have to engagement, the reality might need a little bit more of a nuanced multi-stakeholder approach to really test if what is being reported is valid. And certainly just a final thought is that reporting and disclosing is absolutely essential and important. And I do believe that you cannot manage what you're not measuring, but at the same time, strong action in parallel to that reporting is going to be absolutely essential. So we hope to see a lot of that in line with some of the activities identified.
No, thanks very much for that presentation. Certainly an area I don't know a lot about reporting, so it was very interesting and insightful, and certainly tackling a very difficult animal in terms of the just transition, especially given the fact that it seems to be evolving constantly in terms of focus and visions and definitions. So we're now going to move to the Q&A session. I guess just a bit of protocol before people stick their hands up. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself, which organization you're from, and who your question is for. If no one asks any questions, unfortunately, our panel speakers are going to have to contend with my rather uninsightful and banal questions. But let's hope that we have some inputs. Yes, we have Lauren there. Maybe we'll take a few questions and then we can get our panelists to respond.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for those presentations. I have a question for the first duo. So you spoke about some of the tensions around decentralization in the energy sector and energy planning. I actually think decentralization is a misnomer for what's happening in our energy system right now, and in the power sector specifically. So, and then you also mentioned some of these tensions between what I think is the distribution and perhaps also fragmentation of material infrastructure systems, and then a mismatch between that and what you described, some of the fiscal systems that are in place, but also other administrative systems as well. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts around that tension and what might be required to alleviate it or to intervene in that space, because as you mentioned, we do have this very well, now it's become rapid regulatory reform in that space, And, you know, to some extent, like, you know, the horses have bolted and now we have to catch up with all these other systems around that infrastructural configuration or involved in that infrastructural configuration. And so, yeah, just your thoughts on what might be useful interventions there.
Hi, Sumaya from the University of Johannesburg. I just wanted to, I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about it rather than a question. And this is for Anthony specifically around the unraveling of the MEC and the movement to less capital intensive and more employment intensive kind of industries. And this is really a thought around the fact that industries such as steel and aluminium might actually see an increase in demand as we move towards renewable energies and we move towards electricity generation that's more renewable, and as we move towards these kinds of things. So an increase in steel demand, an increase in aluminium demand, and in some cases an increase in certain kinds of mining, in certain kinds of products of mining. So these are kind of energy intensive sectors, right? So while we're talking on the one hand about sort of less energy intensive sectors, a move towards a structural transformation of that kind of sort, what we might see in the future is actually increases in demand for certain kinds of energy capital intensive sectors. And South Africa, as we know, has been this kind of economy. So in a sense, how do we leverage off that, and how do we kind of green brown industries? Is this a discussion that we kind of need to have as well? And what is the role of kind of green hydrogen in this kind of discussion? And also just thinking back to the structural transformation debates as well, if you think around this from a value chain perspective, if you think around, for example, steel down to machinery and equipment, the argument there has always been not that our steel industry is not important, but how do we leverage our steel industry in order to actually get more benefit downstream for the machinery and equipment industry, which we haven't been able to do. So for me, those kinds of debates are still quite important. So not just a movement away from capital intensive, but also how do we leverage what we already have? Root industries in terms of steel, root industries in terms of sasol and chemicals, and then this idea of kind of greening our brown industries. So comment, but also a question, something to kind of think about. And I don't know if Mike also has a bit of a thought there as well.
No, great. I just want to turn to our online audience. Are there any questions from our online audience? Okay. While we're dealing with that, perhaps we can get going with some responses to those initial inputs.
You can give Anthony first.
No, I think.
Oh, sorry, we can go in the order of the question. So yeah.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I didn't get the name of the first person who asked. Just to say, so I mean, also I should have said in our presentation we have a very lengthy paper which effectively has ended up being 2 papers in one. So caution if you take a look at that anytime soon. And even in that, one of the issues we had to deal with was that Mike felt we should put in more about solutions. And I said, well, actually, there are other people who've been paid large amounts of money to come up with solutions. The first thing we need to do is identify the problems with the current process. So, you know, maybe Mike will have some more thoughts on that. I mean, just to clarify, well, you said you thought it was a misnomer. I'm not sure why, but you know, we're referring to, and you say the horses bolted, and you may be right. Our view, I think, definitely my view, is that is the result of deliberate, heavy lobbying and manipulation of the policy process and the public debate around issues of energy generation and the transition. So essentially this notion, and I mean, I did write about this 5 years ago, saying that there's this push to, you know, there's this notion that, you know, for example, splitting up Eskom and then decentralizing energy production is just going to lead to this magical solution to the Eskom crisis. Now, the people who are saying that are now saying, oh no, Treasury must take on Eskom's debt and so forth. But 5 years ago, they were promising something different. So it is actually the result of a sustained lobbying, and the fiscal considerations haven't been put on the table. Grid connection fees are one way of somewhat mitigating the consequences. So, I mean, just for those who, I don't know, are unfamiliar with this or haven't thought it through, the problem with decentralized generation, if you look at households, for example, it's wealthy households that can afford to invest in solar systems, okay, which in and of themselves would pay back because they're generating electricity more cheaply than they can get from Eskom. But in addition, they still keep the insurance from the grid. So when their solar systems aren't working, they can tap into the grid. But because they're using less, they're actually paying a lower proportion of those costs. So it's actually deeply inequitable. So if you're concerned about a just transition, why aren't people talking about this? Well, because of essentially the very successful lobbying efforts. Yes, I hope there's still some scope to rein that back in, and something like a grid connection fee is one way of doing it. Okay, well, then I guess.
So can we turn over to Professor Anthony Black, who can answer the question that was posed to him?
Yes, and thanks for the question, Samaya. Yeah, I think the issue is, I mean, it's not that we should stop producing steel or aluminium or other heavy industries. It's a question of some adjustment, given the fact that, this heavy industry structure in South Africa did not, in my view, develop in line with our comparative advantage. It was due to a whole lot of artificial support measures. And I think that's also got problems for downstream development, which is where you get employment creation. So I think there's a very difficult issue of adjustment that needs to happen. So yeah, so absolutely. In fact, we should be mining as well. We should be, the mining sector should be expanding. It's actually been undermined by a whole bunch of infrastructure constraints and poor regulation. But how do we adjust? And I think the adjustment does have to be a gradual process. So that's where I'm talking about shifting incentives to sectors which are, well, shifting incentives or creating incentives which are going to actually be more in line with the necessary objectives in the economy. And a key one would be not just output, but particularly employment demanding economic activities. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Professor Black, for that response.
I just wondered if I could add to, is it Soraya's point?
Sumaya's, yeah,
Sumaya,
sure.
Yeah,
go for it.
Okay. Look, I think it's a very important point to raise. The question of what we are going to be doing in terms of this transition, which is going to be capital intensive and not necessarily employment intensive. And I do think that the green hydrogen option becomes very important when we do that. It is a potentially really useful transition if it works, and this is one of the great unknowns. But I'm not sure that we quite understand the scale of operations. And I only know this from the practical point of view when I phoned up Sasol, a particular channel, and I said, look, my Mozambican friends have got 2,000 megawatts of green energy. Would you be interested? And the response was, actually, that's only about 10% of what we're looking for. Now, if you're looking at 20 gigawatts of energy to get into the green hydrogen business at the scale that they're talking, you're talking of huge capital investments, very intensive capital investments, and quite how it's going to be funded and sequenced is a kind of an interesting question. And this is another of those areas where I think we fail to grasp the fact that a lot of the transition is actually going to be quite capital intensive. We're replacing capital infrastructure in a big way. Whether it's decentralized or not is almost irrelevant. And that will not be labor intensive despite the propaganda. When it comes to this issue of decentralization, I must say that my hope is that the finance constraints, and Seán will talk more about that perhaps, that the financial constraints of actually doing all of this sort of grand stuff that we're hoping for will actually succeed in slowing us down. Part of the point of the paper is that we seem to be doing everything the wrong way around. As an engineer who's done some big capital works, if you're doing a big project, you look at your 10, 15-year horizon and you work out a plan of what needs to be done first. What you don't do is start by building the last thing that you need, the guest houses next to the project, before you've actually got the capital in place to build the damn thing. And to some extent, what I'm seeing with this rollout of renewables is very much, let's do the last thing first and delay, as we have in the case of gas, delay the strategic choices for 10 years, guys. 10 years we've delayed our potential gas development, which most countries in the world feel is absolutely essential for a transition. And I look at this and I think, well, at least finance constraints will perhaps get us back onto the right path. But that does then talk to, is it realistic to talk about a successful transition in 28 years? And I think we need to be very cautious about the notion that we're going to successfully transition the South African energy economy in 28 years to net zero. And then we have to think about what we do instead. Thanks.
No, great. Thanks for that response. I see we have a question online from Richard Worthington, and maybe we can ask him to unmute and he can ask his question instead of me having to read it quite difficultly on the side.
Thank you. Yeah, well, the question really is to the narrative that somehow climate finance is part of an agenda driving South Africa against its interests, when all finance is about serving the interests of those who provide the finance. They don't want to return on it. So I wonder how much this is actually a characteristic of climate finance, or whether it isn't. There should be conditions attached to finance around transparency, accountability, and what the overall holistic impact is. Now, of course, we would like to see, a lot of us, these kind of criteria applied to all financing, but the fact that this may be coming through climate finance is not a reason to reject climate finance. So I guess I'm questioning whether it is really being contended that climate finance is just another way of pushing the Northern agenda in the self-interest of the countries involved, for example, in the JTP, or whether this isn't just a rejection of accountability and full impact assessment of all financing. Thank you very much. Oh, and sorry, I'm Richard Worthington, and I'm asking in my individual capacity that I work for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, a German political foundation working with local NGOs. Thanks.
So I guess we can open it to our panelists, whoever wants to bite at that delicious bait.
Thanks very much. Yes, I seem to be the only person who's enthusiastic about responding to that. So first of all, no, I mean, I think we both like to think we come at these issues from a principle point of view. So necessarily the principles should apply across any context. So any finance context. Yes, of course, it's true that other sources of finance, especially international multilateral finance, does get used to manipulate national policy trajectories, sometimes to serve vested interests. I think we do take the view that it is possible to get some finance from these global initiatives in a manner that still protects South Africa's sovereignty and avoids excess distortion of the transition path. So we're not saying reject it in its entirety, but I think, so Richard's kind of saying, well, take it for granted that's the case. Well, that's not reflected in the public narrative, I don't think. And if one looks at how that particular concessional loan was announced in the press, it was basically like this was just free money. And in fact, there was a presentation yesterday where somebody said that they're giving us the money, and they're definitely not giving us the money. But the other thing to understand, and this is a bigger thing which we also still need to unpack elsewhere, is how domestic actors use concessional financing in a manner that implies conditionalities which may not even be there. And we see that actually with the World Bank loan that was taken out. I was in favor of that loan because actually there weren't formal conditionalities, substantive formal conditionalities attached, but there were local actors, including in the media, who sought to frame it as being conditional. Why? Because they wanted to use it as leverage to push their own interests. So I think in terms of the principled issue, we're on the same page. It's not necessarily something about climate finance in particular, but essentially the entire point of this workshop and conference is that this is probably one of the biggest policy issues in South Africa this century. So it matters.
Yeah, sure. So final inputs, and please keep it brief because we are out of time.
Right. Just I mean, very specifically, I engaged Climate Bonds Initiative, who were looking to regulate finance, climate finance for different sectors. It was fascinating watching how the interest groups, and this happened to be around hydropower, were using a climate finance initiative process to push very hard for certain policy objectives, essentially saying, we do not want hydropower because it is bad. And I think part of the difficulty of a lot of these instruments that are run at a global level is that it is very difficult for the global South to participate effectively and protect its interests. And, you know, we finally got Bob Hawke, I think it is, on board from Australia, talking about actually hydropower is green. Wow, you know, what a discovery. But it came through interventions in that channel of saying to the technicians, can you please stop trying to defend your space and go on the aggressive and find a lobbyist who will help you. And it's interesting to watch now that Australia is investing quite heavily on hydropower pump storage because they've seen some advantages to it and they've been able to sideline the opposition. So, you know, this is terrain of struggle. I was always taught that regulation is where the real struggle happens. And I'm afraid we require competences, and that's one of the functions of an organization like TIPS, is to make sure we have the competences to identify our interests and then ensure that somebody fights for them.
Great. Thanks so much for that concluding input. And thanks to everyone for attending the session this morning. So we are, thanks to all the presenters for the very insightful presentations and the discussion, and to all of the audience for the questions, both online and physically here.